Now we're going to use a built-in dataset in order to try and go even deeper when it comes to using qplot. Now let's consider this dataset, empty cars, right? So these are the set of columns that we have in this dataset. Now let's say we want to make a plot of miles per gallon. So we're going to use this column, right? And then we're going to use weight. Okay, so I'm going to create a console. Now let's use empty cars dataset. Say for example we want miles per gallon versus weight. Okay, and say qplot, and then we're gonna have weight, and then we're gonna have miles per gallon. Remember, we have to specify the dataset, which is empty cars, right? And then if you run this, so you observe that we automatically will have a scatter plot. Now let's say we want to add the title and the x limit as well as the y limit. So if we come here and say the main title, it's going to be miles per gallon versus weight. Okay, and then let's give also the labels. We say we will have weight, and then we will have the weight, then we're gonna have the miles per US gallon. Okay, let us also add the x limit as well as the y limit. Okay, if you come here and say the x limit, and then we want to start from 1, say up until 6, and then when it comes to the y limit, say for example we want from 0 to 40. Okay, then we need to change this and say y limit. So what we did here, just a little bit of explanation again, we want to add the title, the x label, as well as the y label. After that, we want to set our own x limits, and then we want to set our own y limits. And if we run this, we come in here into this plot, you observed we have changed the y labels as well as the x labels, and also observe here we have changed the x limit as well as the y limits. So what we have done here, we just used a usual approach. So this approach is a single call to qplot function, but we can also use another approach, okay, and say we want to add layers. Remember, we want to follow grammar of graphics. So in order to do that, we have to build a plot in layers. We don't have to do this, but for demonstration purposes, we are going to look at another way in which we can make the exact same plot, but in that way, we are going to use layers. We're going to keep on adding layers. Now, in order to demonstrate the layers approach, we're going to say qplot and say x is weight, and then say y is miles per gallon, and then we're going to say we want to use this data empty cars. So what happens is that we have to use a plus sign to indicate that we are adding a layer. Okay, so in this case, let's say we want to add title. We're going to say ggtitle, right? And then we pass in the title that we want in our plot. So in this case, let's say we're going to say miles per let's say US gallon. This is weight. Okay, so let's say for example we now add year 1973, 1974 models. Okay, so what we have now done is that we want to see how can we add plots as layers. Okay, we have to use a plus sign. So this indicates that we now want to add title. But now we are not adding it as an argument, but we are adding it as a layer. This is so important, right? So what we are doing is that we are telling R to expect more layers to our plot. So it's more like adding numbers. So when we add ggplot functions in this way, we say we are adding layers. Okay, we can also come here and say add xlabel, and then we pass in and say this here is the weight. And then we also can have a ylabel and say now what we have is miles per gallon, right? And then we come here and say x limit, and then we're gonna say from 1 to 6, and we can also add y limit and say we want to start from 0 to 45, for example, right? So what we have now done is that we have added layers. Okay, so we're now adding layers instead of just passing in these other options that we want to use to customize our plots. We now want to use the layer approach. If we use the layer approach, we use a plus sign to indicate, or in order to tell R that what you should expect is we are adding more and more layers in our plot. So that is why ggplot2 is even more flexible, because remember that when we can also create the object, right? So when we create this, we are creating an object, so we can keep on adding and adding even more layers to that particular object. Okay, so if we run this and you observe from this plot that we have been using the layers. So now this is the new title, and you can observe now this is miles per gallon, this is weight. All right, so that is how you can play around with adding layers, right? So for example, we said this is my qplot, right? And then we said we want to assign this, say to copy this, right? Okay, and then we run this. Now if you say my qplot and say you want to add the title, for example, say this is the title that you want to add, and if you run this, okay, and then let us run this. So now you observe from this plot that the only thing now that we have is this title. This comes from, as it is, from the data set, and the x labels come as they are from the data set, same as the y labels, also the x limit and the y limit. So what we can also do is that we can say my qplot, and then we now say add the x label to be weight. And if you run this, you observe that we now have changed the x labels to be weight. But now notice, if we simply called my qplot and we said add x label as weight, it only changed the weight. Okay, it only changed the weight. It did not keep the title. You should be careful with that. We only added this layer. Okay, so if we say my qplot, and then you come and say xlab, okay, and say this here is now weight. And if you run this, the layers that we only added was the title as well as the x labels. Okay, we can also go ahead and say let's add the y label, say miles per US gallon. If you run this, you notice that now we have this object. We kept on adding layers in this way. So that is why in most cases, most people who want to learn about data visualization, they simply jump into learning ggplot2, which is also a good way to start with your visualization. However, knowing how plot function work and how can you use a base R in order to visualize your data set becomes even more helpful if you want to understand how all of these works, because we have also been looking at how at a usual plot function, and we are familiar with how can we use the usual plot function. So that knowledge will become even more useful. For example, understanding x limit, what's our x limit and what's our y limit. Okay, so that knowledge will even come even more into used when we are heading over to another function, which is ggplots.